The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like the whole mountain had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it out. I felt the shudder through the floor of my observation platform before the first alert reached my screen, and by the time the numbers caught up with what my body already knew, 41 people were sealed under 2 kilometers of broken rock. I am not human. I want that said plainly before anything else, because everything I am about to describe only makes sense once you understand that I was watching from the outside, the way you might watch fish through glass, certain that you understood the water better than they did. My name, in the closest sound your language allows, is Vess. I was sent to this colony world to record how a small human settlement handled the daily business of survival on a planet that had not asked to be settled. I was not sent to record what happened next. Nothing in my training prepared me for it. The mining collapse hit the Deep Works tunnel during the second shift, when the crews were thinnest and the machines were loudest, which meant the warning came late and confused. 39 of the 41 workers were found within the first 6 hours, and none of them survived the collapse itself. The last 2 signals came from a maintenance alcove far below the surface, a narrow pocket of steel and rock that had, by pure chance, held its shape while everything around it folded inward. Those 2 signals belonged to a woman named Elena and her son, a boy of 7 called Milo. 11 hours of air. That was the number the rescue engineers gave when they finally reached the surface command tent, and I remember it precisely because I watched a man named Dorian receive it the way you might watch someone catch a blade with their bare hand. He did not flinch first. He simply stood there, absorbing it, and I assumed, based on everything I have ever recorded about grief, that he would fall. Every species I have studied falls at this point. The knees go first, then the voice, then the will to keep moving. I opened my log to write down exactly how a human father collapses under the weight of an impossible number. He did not collapse. He turned around and walked straight into the tent where the mining foreman was arguing with 3 tired engineers, and he started asking questions that had nothing to do with sorrow and everything to do with mathematics. How fast can the drill bore through collapsed shale? What is the thermal limit on the cutting head before it seizes? Which tunnels still had structural integrity readings above safe threshold? I did not understand, at first, that this was his grief. I thought he had simply refused to feel it yet. I have since learned that for humans, refusal and feeling are not opposites. They can happen in the same breath. The foreman told him the truth, because the foreman was too exhausted to soften it. A full rescue bore would take 14 hours. The air in that alcove would run out in 11. There was a gap of 3 hours between what was possible and what was needed, and nobody in that tent had the first idea how to close it. I expected the tent to fall silent. On most worlds I have studied, this is the moment where hope quietly leaves the room and everyone simply waits for the inevitable, dressing their waiting up as patience. Instead, a woman named Priya, who ran the settlement's small algae farm on the surface, pushed her way to the front of the tent and said something that did not sound like comfort at all. She said that her cyanobacteria strains, the ones used to keep the colony's air processors running, could produce oxygen fast if they were delivered directly into a sealed space. The problem, she admitted immediately, was that nobody had ever tried to deliver living algae through 2 kilometers of broken stone. A geologist named Callum, who had spent the better part of a year drilling water monitoring boreholes across the ridge before the project lost its funding, said something that made the whole tent go quiet in a different way. He said that one of those abandoned boreholes, narrow and forgotten, ran to within 300 meters of the exact alcove where Elena and Milo were trapped. It was 4 centimeters wide, far too narrow for a person, or a drone, or almost anything useful, but not too narrow for a slurry. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I have spent a long time trying to find the right word for it in my own language and never succeeded. It was not hope, because hope requires a belief that things will work out, and nothing in the data supported that belief. It was something closer to disbelief, the kind you feel watching someone attempt a landing you are certain will fail, except you cannot look away, because some small, stubborn part of you wants to be wrong. A young chemist named Owen pointed out the obvious flaw before anyone else could get excited. Cyanobacteria pumped raw through a borehole would die from the pressure and the friction long before reaching the alcove. They needed a carrier, something with the right thickness and the right resistance to heat, that could protect the living cultures on the way down. The only substance on the entire colony with those properties was the emergency fire suppression gel stored in the surface depot, a compound built to smother flames, never designed to carry anything alive. I logged all of this as it happened, the way I log everything, without judgment, simply recording facts as they occurred. I ran my own models on the side, the way any chorus archivist would, because prediction is what my training exists for. My models gave the plan a 9% chance of reaching the alcove at all, and a 4% chance of producing enough breathable air once it arrived. assuming it arrived intact, which itself was unlikely. I trust my models. They have been correct across 11,000 recorded crises on 11,000 worlds. I had no reason, at that point, to expect this one to be different. What I had not accounted for was the noise in that tent. Not panic, though there was plenty of that at the edges. In the mother of Elena who stood near the tent flaps sobbing quietly into her own hands. In the younger workers who kept glancing at the countdown clock as if staring at it hard enough might slow it down. The noise I mean was argument. Correction. People speaking over each other, not out of chaos but out of urgency. Each one trying to fix the flaw in the last person's idea before it cost anyone a minute. Dorian's hands, I noticed, were shaking too badly to hold a stylus, and yet he kept talking, kept pushing numbers at the engineers, kept refusing to let the conversation slow down long enough for despair to catch up with it. Within 90 minutes, working from nothing but spare parts and desperation, they had built a delivery method that had never existed anywhere before. A 4-centimeter borehole meant for water testing. A slurry of living algae wrapped in fire gel never meant to carry anything breathing. A drill head recalibrated on the fly by an engineer who had slept perhaps 2 hours in the last day. I recorded every step, and every step, according to my own careful models, made the plan slightly more likely to fail rather than slightly more likely to succeed. And still they built it. The slurry began pumping down the borehole at hour 9, 2 hours before the air in the alcove was expected to run out entirely. I watched the pressure readings climb and dip in ways that made 3 separate engineers curse under their breath and adjust the flow rate by hand, guessing, because there was no time to calculate properly. At hour 10, the sensors confirmed the slurry had reached the alcove wall. It had not yet broken through. This is the part of the story I have replayed in my archive more times than any other memory I hold, human or otherwise. The chemist, Owen, got on a thin communication line that barely carried a signal through the rock, and he spoke directly to Elena, trapped in the dark with her son's breathing growing shallow beside her, one of her arms broken from the collapse. He walked her, sentence by sentence, through building a crude air scrubber out of a coolant filter and the casing of her own headlamp, so that if the slurry did break through, the alcove would actually have a way to use it, instead of letting the algae simply die in the dark without producing anything at all. She did this with one working arm, in near total darkness, with her son slipping in and out of consciousness against her side. I do not have a model for what that costs a person. I have watched species surrender far less demanding tasks under far less pressure. She did not surrender. She reported back, in a voice flattened by exhaustion but never once by defeat, that the scrubber was built and sealed and ready. At hour 13, with 58 minutes of margin left by my own most generous calculation, the drill broke through the final wall of stone into the alcove. I watched the readings shift the instant it happened, oxygen levels climbing where there had been almost nothing left to breathe. Milo was unconscious when they reached him, but alive. Elena was conscious, exhausted, her voice barely a whisper, and she would not let go of her son, even as the rescue team lifted them both onto stretchers and carried them back through the tunnel they had just barely finished carving open. I sat with that ending for a long time after it happened, longer than I have sat with almost any entry in my archive. I have 11,000 records of crises that ended the way crises are supposed to end, with loss accepted and grief allowed to run its natural course. I did not know how to file this one. It did not fit any of my categories, so I simply wrote down what I saw, without trying to force it into a shape it did not have. I later learned this was not an isolated event, not some strange exception born from one desperate night. I began asking other archivists, stationed across other human settlements, on other worlds, whether they had witnessed anything similar. Every one of them had a story of their own. A ship's hull breached far from any repair station, patched in hours using a medical adhesive and a printed steel plate that should have taken days to manufacture, made instead by a crew who refused to sleep until it was finished. A child on a distant outpost with a failing organ and no transplant bank within months of travel, saved by a father who grew a replacement from his own cells using a bioprinter meant for livestock, because the mother in that story, like Elena, refused to accept the words "there is nothing more we can do." There is an old phrase among my people, older than our written records, that says grief is the shape a species takes when it finally agrees with the universe. I have carried that phrase with me across 11,000 worlds, and I believed it completely, until I watched a father with shaking hands refuse to let a countdown clock decide his son's fate. Humans, I have come to understand, do not agree with the universe so easily. I have watched them argue with it, negotiate with it, build strange and unlikely tools to push back against it, and on more occasions than my models ever predicted, I have watched the universe be the one to yield first. I do not know if this makes your species wise or simply reckless in a way that occasionally works. My calculations still struggle to separate the two when it comes to you, and I have begun to suspect that perhaps there is no clean separation to find, that the two qualities are woven together so tightly in humans that pulling them apart would remove whatever it is that keeps you going. I closed my official log that day with a single line, breaking the format my order has used for longer than your species has had written language, because I could not find a colder or more precise way to say what I meant. I recommended that the chorus stop assuming human limits were limits at all. 3 weeks later, I watched Milo turn 8 years old, lit by the same floodlights that had once lit the rescue tent, where his father refused to give up on him. Dorian burned the cake trying to bake it himself instead of asking for help, which struck me as very much in character. Elena, her arm still healing in a sling, laughed so hard at the sight of it that she had to sit down on an overturned crate to catch her breath. I have 11,000 entries in my archive that taught me how to record an ending. It took one small mining colony, one impossible number, and 2 exhausted parents who refused to listen to it, to finally teach me how to record a refusal instead. I do not know what to call that feeling. Watching a species argue its way out of a fate that should have been settled. I only know that after everything I have seen across every world in my archive, it is the one memory I return to when I need to remember why I still find your species worth watching at all.